Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and as usual, I'm coming to you from the city of Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And it is always a pleasure to get the chance to sit down and talk about jazz with the various guests that we have on our show. But this time around, it is a particular treat for me to be joined on the phone from the state of New York by one of the most legendary bassists in jazz history, Mr. Bill Crow, a man who has been playing the bass and other instruments for over 3/4 of a century. He's collaborated with some of the most important names in jazz and has graced countless records by many jazz giants: Stan Getz, Jerry Mulligan, Zoot Sims, Bob Brookmeyer, Al Kahn, Clark Terry, J.J. Johnson, Marion McPartland, Benny Goodman, Milt Jackson, and the list just goes on and on and on. And of course, he has also led many of his own sessions. I had the good fortune of spending about an hour and 20 minutes chatting with Bill Crow about his amazing career and musical legacy. And I can tell you it has been truly a treat. And to kick off the conversation, I asked Bill to go back and reminisce about his first encounter with music in general and with jazz in particular.
Well, they are because my mother was a musician. She sang, she was a soprano, and she played the piano and the organ, and sang in her church. And we lived near Seattle, so she found some work on radio stations in Seattle until the networks came in and wiped out all the local talent.
Was there a jazz scene in Seattle at the time, or wasn't that easy to find that kind of music over there in the early 30s?
Well, it was there, but I didn't know anything about it until I got into the Army in 1946, and when I came back out of it, I moved into Seattle to be close to the University of Washington, and I discovered that there were jam sessions going on in the music building there, and then I met a bunch of musicians who showed me that in the black neighborhood there were 5 or 6 clubs where there was jazz playing. And Quincy Jones was there at that time. He was still in high school, I think. And Ray Charles was in town. So I was really pleasantly surprised to see that, because I had been a jazz record collector since I was in junior high school, but I had no access to all of that music in Seattle until I got back out of the Army.
How did you first hear the music? Because you said you'd been a record collector, jazz record collector, since you were in junior high. How did that happen? Do you remember how you felt, or how did you first listen to jazz music?
Well, I probably had heard some of it on the radio because I had my ear stuck to the radio as soon as we got one. I was about 5 years old, I think. We got a little table radio, and that was our link to the outside world. Everything. There was the classical music and comedy and some jazz, but it wasn't until my mother tried to start me on the piano when I was about 4 or 5, I guess, but I didn't have the ability to separate my hands the way you need to play the piano. So I kind of hit a wall there and didn't go any further with it. But in the 4th grade, we got a new music teacher in our school system, and he saw that nothing was coming up. His senior high school band was graduating, and not much was coming up. So he came all the way down to the 4th grade where I was and passed out sheets of mimeographed list of musical instruments and said, if you want to play one of these, let me know and I'll talk to your folks, So I saw trumpet there, and I knew what that was. So I checked that off. And my folks, it was the Depression, but my folks scraped up the $9.95 that Sears Roebuck was charging for a trumpet at the time. And they ordered one for me. And I started playing in the grade school band. And then about the time I was in the 6th grade, I was walking by my music teacher's house one day, and he waved to me and said, "Come on in here, I want you to hear something." And he put on Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, knowing I was a trumpet player. And that just blew me away. I couldn't believe how wonderful that sounded. And I was also very impressed with the fact that he had flat records that had 2 tunes on each one, because at home we had an old used Edison phonograph with the cylinder records, and I think we had about 12 cylinders. Most of them were vaudeville music, or there's a couple by Sir Harry Lauder singing Scotch songs. And there was one a cello player playing the Swan, and the recording was so bad I thought I hated cellos until I heard a real one. But that really got me turned on to. I started looking on the radio for jazz music, and then I found out that in the electric store downtown in Kirkland, they sold refrigerators and stoves and stuff like that. But over in the corner, there was a stack of 78s and a little record player. You could listen to them to see if you wanted to buy them. And fortunately, whoever was stocking their record collection there, it wasn't just the popular tunes of the day. There was some real jazz there. Well, of course, the popular music was closer to jazz in those days than it is now. But besides the big bands like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw and Tommy Dorsey and all of that, I liked those records, and I bought some of them. Records were very cheap, and I had a little after-school job by the time I got into junior high school. And so I could afford to buy a record or two once in a while. And they also had Commodores and Ash and Signature, a lot of small labels. And so I was, and I didn't know anything about different styles or anything like that. I just knew who I liked. I thought Jack Teagarden was wonderful. And I had an album of Mary Lou Williams stuff that Bill Coleman was on. He had Europe, but that was my first exposure to the kind of Kansas City music. For some reason, I didn't get any Count Basie or Lester Young records at that time. I think I heard one Count Basie record where he was just playing simple blues, and there were no other solos, and I wasn't too impressed with that. But I loved the Ellington stuff. I thought Johnny Hodges was wonderful, and Lawrence Brown and those people. So I bought a lot of those records, and then I found a couple of kids in school that were also interested in jazz. So we got together and listened to records together, that sort of thing. And then the same music teacher, I complained to him when I was in the 6th grade that I couldn't seem to get enough lip to play high enough to play the first parts. I wanted to play the melody. And he said, well, maybe a bigger mouthpiece would fit your teeth better. He said, the school owns a baritone horn and nobody's playing it, and it has a lot of wonderful parts in the concert band repertoire. They get all the cello parts. And So I took the school horn home and found out that I liked it a lot. And by the time I got into high school, I'd found an after-school job that paid enough money that I could buy a baritone of my own. I found a nice King over in Seattle and a music store, and they were willing to let me pay it off on time. I gave them $5 a week until I paid off the $75. You know?
Well, it seems to me
my music teacher started a swing band, just playing stocks, you know. And so I wanted to be in that, and he said, "Well, there's no baritone horn parts for the swing band." So I thought about that for a minute, and then I realized that my brother had gone into the Navy already. The war had started, and he had left a Busher Alto under his bed when he went into the Navy. So I got that out, practiced on it for a while until I could play the middle register, and then I started playing third alto in the swing band. And I did that for my junior year, and then my senior year, we merged with another high school that had 2 or 3 very good saxophone players. And they kind of put me out of a job. So, but our drummer had graduated and nobody was playing drums. So I went over to the service station where he worked and had him show me what he was playing on the hi-hat and how to play brushes and all that sort of thing. And then for my senior year, I played drums with that swing band. And then when I started college, they still didn't have a drummer, so I would go back to high school and play with the swing band until I went into the Army. And the same thing happened in the Army. It turned out, it took me a long time to get into a band, but when I finally did, it turned out that all of the drummers there were either street drummers or classical percussionists, and nobody played the drum set. So I had bought an old used drum set while I was playing in high school. So I sent home for the drums, and I played all the service club jobs. And there was a cornet player in that band from Massachusetts that he liked everything from Louis Armstrong up to about Muggsy Spaniard, I think. And he was a self-professed moldy fig. And so he got me to play in tailgate baritone horn with him. And once in a while we would, he had a clarinet playing friend that lived in Massachusetts who would come down. We were stationed in Maryland. He would come down for a visit once in a while, and we would have a real Dixieland front line there. So one day he said to me, "You know, the baritone's not really the right horn for jazz. Why don't you get a valve trombone? His finger's just the same, and it sounds more like a jazz instrument." So I did. I went into Baltimore and found a used valve trombone, and then when I was playing service club jobs on the drums, I would keep the trombone on a stand beside me, and when it was a chance for me to play a solo, I'd hand the sticks to the trumpet player, and he'd play the cymbal while I kept the feet going and play my chord. And that was how I got started improvising.
I was going to say before, Bill, that it seems like for a lot of jazz musicians of your generation, the school medium was very important when it came to starting out in music. And also in your case, it looks like you are proficient, or at least you have played many instruments, in many cases, from what you're telling me, out of necessity because it was needed. And I'm wondering how you finally settled on the bass. How did that happen?
Well, when I came back out of the Army, I met this drummer from Olympia, Washington. He had been in New York for a while, but he'd been in an auto accident and fractured his skull, and he had gone back to stay with his mother for a while. while he healed up. And now he was back in Seattle looking around to see what was on the music scene, and he met me. And we liked each other, and liked the same kind of music pretty much. In the Army, I had started listening to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and my moldy fig friend couldn't see how I could like that music, but I couldn't see why it wasn't all right to like all kinds of jazz. So this drummer Buzzy, he liked my talent, but he couldn't believe how innocent I was. He just thought I was completely uneducated about the facts of life and the underworld of the music business and all of that. So he decided he was going to hit me, And he used to take me up to his room and play records for me, and he showed me about swing, and he put on some really good swinging records and danced them out for me, and I really saw what he was talking about. I still use some of the things that he taught me. Trying to get a rhythm section to go, but once in a while he would send me. He had a little job with an organ player in a club in Seattle, and once in a while, if he had something better going, he would send me in to sub, because he knew I could cover the job, but I didn't play good enough to steal it. So he made a better drummer out of me, and then he got an after-hours job. In those days, the legal clubs that sold liquor stayed open till 12, and that was it. The WCTU was very strong out there, and so there were a lot of illegal after-hours clubs, and Buzzy talked one of them into putting a jazz band in there. And so he got Freddie Greenwell's a good tenor player, and this girl, Betty Christopher, her original name was Stitt, I think, but she was from Chicago and had studied with Lenny Tristano, and was out on the road with an all-girl band, and they got stranded in Seattle. They were on their way to a job in Alaska that got canceled. So Buzzy discovered her, and immediately he got this gig in order to try to hire her because he had eyes for her. And sure enough, she came in and played real well. So I had a regular job playing drums, and that ended at midnight. And then I'd run down to this club and sit in on bongos and play with Buzzy's band. And then this piano player, Betty, decided she was ready to go back to New York. So Buzzy decided he would go back to New York too. He kind of left some loose ends dangling there that he thought he could get back into the music business. And he said to me, if you want to be a musician, you got to go where the music is. Why don't you come to New York with me? So I had $50 in my pocket and my valve trombone, and we got on the Greyhound bus and came out here. And there was a trumpet player named Gene Rowland that we knew that found a summer job up in Tupper Lake, New York. It's almost to the Canadian border. And he took 4 guys up there, Buzzy and 2 horn players, himself and a tenor player, and a piano player. And he had a big fight with the owner's wife on opening night and stalked out and abandoned the band. He went back to New York. So Buzzy rescued the job. He told the owner, I can get you a band. And he got Freddie Greenwell to come out, and he found a trumpet player named Marty Bell that he liked. And John Benson Brooks was a songwriter and piano player that was a real recluse. He hadn't been out of his apartment for 7 years, I don't think. And Buzzy talked him into taking this summer job. And he said to me before he left, he said, if you want a nice weekend in the mountains, hitchhike on up and I'll put you up in my room, bring your horn, you can play. So I did that, 4th of July, 1950. And I hitchhiked up there with a friend and sat in that first night. And he went to the boss. He told me later that he said, "Sounds good with the extra horn, right?" And the boss says, "Yeah, it does." He said, "This guy's in great demand in the city, but his doctor found a spot on his lung and told him to stay in the mountains for a while and get some fresh air. So I think maybe you could get him if you made him an offer." Well, I don't think the boss bought much of that, but he said, "Well, offer him $15 a week in room and board and see how he likes that." Well, I loved it. And about the third day I was there playing trombone, I walked in one night and there was a string bass on the stand. And I said, "Oh, did the boss finally break down and let you hire a bass player?" And he said, "No, he won't go for the extra rhythm section player, but he said, I can't stand to play without a bass. So when you're not playing the trombone, you got to try to play this bass." Well, I knew what the tuning was on the bass from high school, but I'd never really played one. But I knew I had a good ear for harmony, and I knew from my record collection what bass players were supposed to sound like. So it was just a matter of finding the notes on the instrument. I had the whole summer to do it. And by the time I came back to New York, I could offer myself as a bass player on club days and things. Except I didn't have a bass. I would have to go rent one if I got a job.
It's interesting what you mentioned.
I wanted to sell a bass and got my own.
What you mentioned about the bass is interesting because I feel like, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I feel like in jazz, the bass seems to be an instrument that is even more important than in other styles of music because, there's a lot of bass solos and it's got a lot of importance in the rhythm section. How would you define the importance of the string bass in jazz?
Well, I didn't have to play any solos for the first year that I was playing bass. They just wanted me to play good rhythm, and I had a good ear for the notes. I just had to not be too unlucky. I would miss notes that I intended to play, that kind of thing, till I found out. And I had to make up a fingering system. I didn't know there was a standard one. I was playing for a year or two, and I started to work some decent jobs, and I still didn't know how come I was working harder to play the instrument than all the other bass players that I looked at. But I finally went to a teacher and got that straightened out.
Now you also you took lessons, or at least you did study the instrument with a musician from the New York Philharmonic. Is that correct?
Yeah, Fred Zimmerman. He was the first best bass player at the Philharmonic at that time. Well, I had already spent a couple of years. Just every job was another lesson. They'd hire me for something that I could do, and then I discovered they expected me to be able to do other things that I couldn't yet, and I'd have to hurry up and learn them, And one of the best jobs was, I started out with rehearsing with Teddy Charles. He had a trio of guitar players, but he didn't have much work. But I went up to his apartment every day and rehearsed with him, and he showed me all the bebop changes and all that. And then his guitar player got a job and left. So he got Jimmy Rainey to come and play with us. Jimmy had playing with Stan Getz, but Stan went to the West Coast by himself. So Jimmy had the summer off, and we added him to our trio. Then when Stan came back, he called Jimmy and said, I got a gig in Boston, and Roy Haynes is up here, so we'll use him, and I got a good piano player, so just get a bass player and come on up, So that was how I got the job. And I thought it was just going to be for a week, but it turned into 6 months. And I ended up recording with Stan and all that. Now I'm still just learning, Jimmy was showing me what chords Stan liked to play on certain standards and things like that, and taught me some new tunes that he was playing. So then Jimmy, Roy Haynes only played that 1 week with us because he was living in Boston. But when we came back to New York to play at Birdland, it was Frank Isola and Duke Jordan and me. And right around that time, Norman Granz had signed Stan. He'd been recording for Roost before that. And so I got a chance to be on a couple of record dates right away. And I got my name around a little bit. And then we had he replaced Frank Isola with Kenny Clark for some reason. I don't know why, but I liked playing with both of those guys. And but then Duke Jordan and Kenny got something else to do, and they resigned. So Stan said, "Well, I guess I got to start a whole new group. Who should we get?" And I said, "Well." I heard a wonderful valve trombone player at a session the other day, Bob Brookmeyer. And so he called Bob and hired him, but Bob couldn't come to work right away because he had to give somebody 2 weeks' notice. I think he was playing with Ray Anthony or somebody playing piano. So Johnny Mandel came out and did the 2 weeks with us that Bob couldn't do. We played in Baltimore and Washington, I think. And then Brookmeyer came on the band, and that band had Johnny Williams on piano and Alan Levitt on drums. And for some reason, that rhythm section never really gelled like the other ones had. And so Stan decided to go back to his original bass player, was Teddy Kotick. Mm-hmm. He let me go. Teddy was working with Claude Thornhill at the time. So he left Claude and went with Stan. They went headed for the West Coast. And I went back to New York and ran into Winston Welch, the drummer, who was with Thornhill. And he said, "Hey, man, we just lost our bass player." I said, "I know, he just took my job." And he said, "Well, gee, are you open?" And I said, "Sure, I am. I don't have anything planned." And so he got me hired, and we went right up to Erie, Pennsylvania for the first job. And it was one-nighters for that whole summer of 53. We went down south and out to Texas and Oklahoma. And then we did a week or two down in New Orleans in July, playing on an ice show and ballroom dancing. But I learned a lot on that band because I had to. Just his theme song was a problem for me. It was in the key of D flat, and the bass line went through a tenth, and I didn't know how to make those shifts. I wanted to play a long sound, a legato sound, and I couldn't do it. So after the first night of humiliating myself on that tune, I sat in my hotel room and figured out that there was a way to play across the strings that I hadn't figured out before. And so that started to get my hand around into the right position to play the way normal bass players did. And then when that job came to an end at the end of the summer, But I got another job with Terry Gibbs's quartet. Terry Pollard was the pianist, and Frank DeVito was the drummer. And we were working like a week at a time on the jazz circuit. That was nice. We went to Chicago and Toronto and Boston and Philadelphia and like that. And then he was on his way out to the coast, and I didn't want to do that. So I left Terry, and I was working with Jerry Wald. It was a couple of weeks at the round table, I think. And we had played a concert with Terry that had three groups on it. It was Terry's quartet and Marion McPartland's trio and Ahmad Jamal's quartet. And so I had met Marion on that date, and she called me and said her bass player was leaving. Would I like to come and be with her trio? She had a steady job at the Hickory House. Well, that was wonderful. That was my first steady job in town. And Joe Morello was the drummer. Mm-hmm. And Marion liked the way I played, but she loved to change keys, and she would get into the keys that were hard on the bass sometimes. So that was really forcing me to figure out new scales, and it improved my playing a lot, just having to fight my way through some of those hard keys. And then I was there for a couple of years. And then I had met Jerry Mulligan when he was still around, just trying to get writing work around town and playing a little baritone. And then he had gone to California about the same time that I went with Stan Getz. So he came back into the city, and he had a sextet that was originally Peck Morrison and Dave Bailey were the bass player and drummer, and Idris Suleiman was playing trumpet, and Brookmeyer was playing trombone, and Zoot was playing tenor. Mm-hmm. So Idris and Peck both had something else that they were going to go to. I think Johnny Hodges was starting the band. And so Jerry hired John Erdley, and mm-hmm. Brooke recommended me. And so I was very happy with Marion, but I could not turn that offer down to get a chance to play with Zoot and Jerry and Bob, So I gave Marion my notice, and off I went with the sextet. We finished up an album he had started with the other band, and then we did a European tour, and we came back, and Zoot went off to do something else with Al Cohen, and John Erdley went to Florida for some reason. So we were just a quartet with Brookmeyer, and we made an album, and we toured around the circuit for a while, and then I had a fight with Jerry over something stupid and left, and then I was doing an off-Broadway show and playing some little jazz gigs around here and there, and this is nearly a year later. He called me up and said that he was starting a new quartet with Art Farmer. Would I like to be on it? And I certainly did. And so I sent in a sub on this show, and met with Jerry. We started rehearsing, and then we did Newport, and we recorded, and we did a European tour with that quartet. And
Bill, one thing that you're mentioning is you definitely, if you look at the list of recordings that you made, it's absolutely amazing, and I have a lot of those, and I have listened to them throughout the years, throughout my life, really. These are records that have been with me, and you've been on them. And
Yeah.
you started recording in the 1950s, and I was wondering, what were record dates like in those days? Could you describe more or less what would happen, how
Well,
the records were
uh,
made?
the union rate for a record date was usually like a 3 hour date, and that included an hour of rehearsal, and there was a certain price for that period of time, and you were allowed to record a certain number of tunes. So if they wanted to do in those days,
I'm
well,
sorry.
the very first record date I did was as a vocal group. I was singing with Davy Lambert's singers, and and we were just doing two sides because it was 78s in those days, and so that was a date for Meredith Williams. But then the first things that I did on bass, they were just now starting to have both 45s and 33 and a third, the speeds on the record players, and nobody knew which format was going to really take over. The different companies were placing their bets, and so the first date that I did with Stan, Norman Granz put some of the records out on 78s under the Mercury label, and some on 45s under the Norgran label, and some on 10-inch LPs with a 33 and a third under the Verve label. And then later, most of those 10-inch LPs got expanded to 12-inch because that became the format everybody liked. So we would go into the studio and run over tunes, and then decide how we were going to do them, and then they would start recording. And in those days, they were recording. I'm not sure now whether that very first record date I did was record. I don't think tape recorders were any good yet in 1950. There were some tape recorders out because I know I bought one when I was just home out of the Army, but they were crude, and I don't think they were using them for professional recordings yet. But eventually, they found out that if they made the recording heads wider and the tape wider, that they could get more fidelity onto the tape, and it was easier to edit. So all of that stuff was being invented, and at the time that we were starting to record. Usually, if they were going to do an LP that had 10 tunes on it, something like that, they would do a double date. They'd give you 6 hours. And then you'd be in the studio that long.
Did you get to record many different versions of the same song, like different takes of the same song, or would you rehearse them really well to kind of do them in 1 or 2 takes right away?
Well, depended. The first things that we did with Stan, we were playing tunes that we were playing on the job, so we didn't have to do anything. But I know Duke Jordan was really brilliant at playing introductions, and he would just play a beautiful little 4-bar intro, and we'd be in, And Stan would carry the main thing, and the rhythm section would just support him. And if he didn't make any mistakes, which he rarely did, you usually do it in 1 or 2 takes,
Now, when it comes to as a musician playing with a big band or playing in a small group setting? What's the difference in feel? What's the difference for a musician, a jazz musician, a jazz bassist, as yourself, playing with a big band like Claude Thornhill's, which was pretty forward-looking kind of swing band, and then doing small group dates?
Well, it was all pretty much the same thing as trying to get the rhythm section to feel the same way together is the way you start out. I was lucky that the drummers were all playing pretty soft in those days, with the exception of Buddy Rich, and so it was easy to get a good blend. People like Kenny Clark and Roy Haynes and Frank Isola and Winston. They all played even and soft and yet with a strong rhythmic feel. The ideal rhythm section on those days was Joe Jones and Walter Page and Count Basie and Freddie Green. And anytime that we had the feeling that it wasn't really swinging, we would think about those guys and see what we could do to try to emulate that,
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it wasn't for a bass player, and nobody was playing amplified in those days. They didn't have good pickups for basses yet, and so we all had our action high and were playing hard, trying to make ourselves heard. When we moved from gut strings to steel strings and could lower our action a little bit, it was a little easier to get some volume. And then when they invented pickups that really made the bass sound good amplified, then you could really lower your action. And the bass players all grabbed onto that, and virtuoso soloists started to show up. That never really appealed to me enough for me to want to work really hard to get that ability, because I liked the fat sound of the rhythm and the bass in the rhythm section, and so I started to play solos, but I always tried to play melodic solos that swung. Was more like I would think on the trombone than on the bass, But I never tried to be a technical wizard. I just wanted to play those good notes.
You did mention before that you, for a while, began to study the bass formally with Fred Zimmerman of the New York Philharmonic, and I wonder, how important is it for a jazz musician to be formally trained? How does that influence your music?
Well, it was a necessity. When I joined Jerry's sextet, I realized that I had been able to play in the upper register with my homemade fingering system if I could work my way up to those notes. But if I had to go directly to them, like I needed to for some of his arrangements, I had to make chalk marks on the bass to know where I was going. And so the only guy I had ever talked to that said anything about studying the bass was Trigger Alpert. He was on staff over at CBS. Mm-hmm. And when I played something over at that radio station with Marion, we had a lot of time between rehearsal and broadcast. So he was showing me around the studio. And he said, and this is the room where I practice for my lessons, So I called him up and I said, who are you studying with? And he told me Fred Zimmerman. And fortunately, that was exactly the kind of person I needed, because Fred, actually his picture was, when he was a young man, was in the basic lesson book that everybody used to study the bass. And he had a beautiful technique. So I made an appointment for a lesson. I went over to his apartment, and he said, "Well, take out your bow and play me something, you know." And I said, "Ben, I own a bow, but I use it only for the last note, you know. I'm a pizzicato player." And he says, "Oh, yeah, and you're working." So it was hard for him to understand that there were a whole bunch of us that just played pizzicato. So I started studying. Whenever we were in town, I would go over there and take a lesson every week. And when I was on the road, I'd just work hard on whatever things he gave me, and then I'd come back and take some more lessons. And I found that there was a standard fingering system that I didn't know about, and it was logical. And within a year, I had really developed a good left hand that I didn't have before. So, you know, I'd always been able to read music, but I had never really studied bass parts before, except when I was on Claude's band. And I discovered that a lot of arrangers wrote terrible bass parts in the whole swing field. You know, they would write from the piano, or they didn't know how to make a line lead in a way that pulled you through the harmony. And that's something that some of the best bass players I've been listening to did so well. Oscar Pettiford and Ray Brown, people like that. Mm-hmm. And so I started recomposing bass parts as I played them, you know. It seems to me that when I played things that were written by Al Cohn or Manny Album or Bob Brookmeyer, the bass lines, I wouldn't need to recompose them so much, because they understood about how the bass lines work. And that was another thing that Fred Zimmerman showed me. He said there's sometimes 2 or 3 different ways to finger a passage, and one way will be easier, but he said be sure to practice the hard way, because one day that'll be the only thing that's available, and you'll to know how to do that.
Now, you mentioned before, Bill, that you were fascinated early on with the sound of the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and then in July 1958, you got a chance to play with the man himself at Lewiston Stadium. And yeah. I wonder, because you've mentioned that was one of the biggest thrills of your life. What do you remember about the concert and about playing with the Duke?
Well, it was Jerry's. I was there with Jerry's group, and we were opposite Duke. And Duke had something to do that evening, I think. Anyway, he asked Jerry if it would be all right if he started the concert rather than finish it, even though he had the big band. And so Jerry said sure. And then Duke looked around and he saw that his bass player wasn't there. So he looked at his watch, and we were playing the Lewiston Stadium was outdoors, you know. He's looking at the sky. He's not sure if it's going to rain. And so he came over. I'm standing there with my bass, and he pulls me by the coat and said, "Come with me." And I went down, and I started to get the book out. It was underneath the music stand, which was right next to Duke's piano. And Britt Woodman leaned over and said, "Oh, don't do that. That's all been changed." So he said, "Just hang around in B flat for a while Duke's talking, and we'll tell you when to change." So Duke went out and did his announcements, and I'm playing with the rhythm section. And then he kicks off. He would just sit down at the piano and play some little cue that the band would then know what tune they were going into. And and Britt would holler the key to me, and Duke would. He had sense enough to go back in the book to tunes that everybody knows that I certainly would have heard and possibly played, and I was getting through it just fine until he came to a ballad he wanted to play, and he knew I didn't know it because it was one of his more recent things, and so he sat down at the piano right next to me, and he would just point at the bass note on the keyboard, and I caught it right away. And as soon as he saw that was working, he just led me through the whole arrangement by pointing at my note without playing it. And I'm standing there looking so pleased that Jerry actually got bugged. He said, "How come you don't play it? How come you don't enjoy playing with me that much?" I said, "Oh yeah, you get to do all the time. Let me have my fun."
What would you say, Bill, that is so special about Duke Ellington's music?
Well, it was so personal. He wrote not for an instrument, but for a person. You know. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I heard a little beep. I wondered if I had lost you again.
No, I am here, and I agree with you. You often read that Duke Ellington played the orchestra like it was an instrument.
Yeah, he sure did. And he had a way, like he'd hear the guys warming up or jamming a little or something like that, or he'd listen to somebody's solo and he would hear a little melodic phrase and he'd remember it and he'd turn it into a tune, you know. A lot of times things that he had taken from Johnny Hodges' solos, when Duke would announce them as one of his compositions, Johnny would be standing behind him pretending to count money.
It's you mentioned before that you had gone on a European tour, and really you've traveled the world with your music. You've been to South America, to parts of Europe, to Japan, even to Spain, where that's the country where I was born myself. And in 1962, with the Benny Goodman Orchestra, you visited the USSR, and I wonder what it was like to play jazz, to play swing in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and how that trip came about. What do you remember about it?
Well, they'd been taught, you know, the State Department had been very successful with the Voice of America broadcasting jazz behind the Iron Curtain. And people had been encouraging them to sponsor some live music. And they had a couple of times offered the Ellington band or the Bassist band. And the Russians had been afraid of them because they'd heard about the riots at Newport, and they didn't know that was rock and roll. They thought, you know, it's all American jazz is the same. So they were afraid that something like that would happen over there, and they didn't want to. They didn't know how they would control it, you know. So when somebody suggested Benny, because Benny also played classical music, they were a little easier about that, and it was just coming at a time when there was a bit of a thaw in the Cold War. You know, Khrushchev was in power there, and so anyway, they settled on Benny as the first band to go over there, and the State Department put up some money, and Benny was. I think John Bunch helped Benny put the band together because he hadn't had a band for a while, and so John told him that Mel Lewis and I played well together, and so that was how we got hired. And it was just a wonderful group of musicians. I was really so proud of that band. But Benny got competitive with someone. He tried to outplay Phil Woods, and he didn't do it too well. And he liked Joe Newman, but he was kind of tough with the rest of the band for no good reason, So, but I was very interested to be there because, we had the only thing we knew about Russia was what we'd heard from the propaganda mill over here, And I remember when we landed in Moscow first, and as the plane's coming in, I look out the window and I thought, well, gee, this looks very much like the Pacific Northwest. I know these trees. I know, and the people all look like people. Same people that I know. The only thing that was different was the architecture. The buildings looked different, especially the older ones. But we made a lot of musical friends there, and there was a lot of worrying about trying to keep the fans from rushing up to the stage and all that. They would have big, tough guys standing there looking like bouncers at a nightclub. And the first couple of nights in Moscow, we were giving concerts at a very large hall. And the people were all sitting there being very subdued and polite applause. They would look. Khrushchev was there the first night, so they would look up there to see if he was applauding, and then they would applaud. But we thought, well, gee, we heard that there were a lot of jazz fans here. We thought they'd be more enthusiastic. Then we realized, if you were a politician in Russia and couldn't get a ticket to this opening night, you didn't have any clout at all, So it was there were no jazz fans in the audience for the first two nights, and then we started to get our people, and they were a little more demonstrative about their approval.
Did you feel that they knew the music well? That they were knowledgeable about the music over there?
Well, some of them were. See, the Voice of America had been getting through very well over there. They took shortwave radios, but everybody had a shortwave radio. Mm-hmm. And they would get both news and music that way. And the musicians in each of the cities that we went to, with the exception of Tashkent, were quite up on the latest. They knew they'd been hearing the Cannonball records and the Horace Silver records and all that. So it was lucky that we had, our two piano players were Teddy Wilson and John Bunch, neither of whom were up on the latest tunes. But Victor Feldman was there as our pipes player. So when we went out to play sessions, he was our.
Yeah.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I don't know if beeping means that somebody's calling me or not, but they'll leave a message, I guess.
Well, you were mentioning Victor Feldman, who I believe was British.
Yeah. But he was a great piano player, and he'd played on some very modern groups, so he knew all the latest tunes.
You mentioned before that Goodman had gotten competitive with somebody, and you hear a lot of stories about Goodman's personality. What was it like to work with Benny Goodman?
Well, he was, and we had all admired his playing and had grown up with that music, But we were also adults and wanted to be adults, and he would do things like he didn't want to stay in the same hotel as the band, and the Russians said no. and he wasn't very friendly. He with the exception of Zoot and Joe Newman, he tried to mess with everybody. You know, he insisted. Well, who was an old friend of his, would come and be the lead trumpet player, and then by the time we got to Russia, he had him playing a fourth. So, I wrote a whole article about that trip that's on my website, and originally was published in Gene Lee's Jazz Letter.
Yeah, I actually have read that, and it's really interesting, and I would like to recommend that everyone out there listening to our conversation would seek that one out and read more about that trip to the USSR. Since you've traveled all over the world with your music, I wonder, how do international audiences compare to American audiences when it comes to jazz?
Oh, I think it's about the same. Although, well, Norman Granz was the first one to. He figured that the music at jam sessions was so interesting. Why couldn't we put that on the stage and just have guys jam? And so that was what he started out, Jazz at the Philharmonic. He rented the Philharmonic Hall in L.A. And the audiences were so enthusiastic that they told him that he couldn't rent the Philharmonic Hall anymore. So he took it first on the road to all of the other concert halls in the United States, and then he found out that he could put it together in Europe and charge some real prices, and people would come, you know. So he moved his whole operation to Europe and became a rich man over there.
I know that when you came back from that trip to the Soviet Union, you took part in pianist Eddie Costa's last session before his passing. And that's for pianist, it's a particular favorite of mine. So I'm wondering what he was like as an individual. What was he like as a musician, too?
Oh, he always had a smile on his face, and he was always very happy-go-lucky. Drank a little too much. That was how he got killed. He just had an auto accident. Mm-hmm. But Jack Lewis grabbed the whole band when we got off the plane coming back from that trip, because he thought that he would steal a march on Benny and get a record out before Benny could get his record out. So it just happened that none of our piano players had gotten on that plane. A couple of guys had gone to Sweden, and a couple of guys had gone to Paris, and so he had to hire a couple of ringers, and Eddie was the one that he hired for the piano, and it was a brilliant choice because Eddie really played well on that record.
And so that's how he got on that session, because there was no piano player.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he had to replace a couple of trumpet players too, because Joe Newman and Joe Wilder had both gone to Sweden from Russia.
You've also backed several singers like Mel Torme and Nina Simone and Chris Connor and several others. And, you know, when I began listening to jazz when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old, it was through vocal jazz that I got interested in jazz. And then it was that there was a transition, so to speak, to instrumental jazz coming up later on. And I'm wondering, when you are backing a singer, in what ways does your playing change when you have to do that?
Well, it doesn't change that much for the bass player and the drummer. You're just trying to establish a good, strong rhythmic feel. The piano player and the horns have got to watch out that they don't step on the singer. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Was it something that you enjoyed doing, backing singers? Or...
Sure. If they're good singers, they're just part of the band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You were also mentioning before that one of your friends had been wondering how was it possible that you liked the music of Charlie Parker and the new bebop style, and of course you lived through this divide between swing music and then the more modern, more forward-looking bebop. What do you remember about that? Was there really that big a divide between those styles?
Well, it was a lot of the divide was manufactured by writers, but some of it, there are some of the old guard. They didn't want to have to learn any new tunes. They didn't want to have to learn any new ways of playing, But like Coleman Hawkins and Don Byas and some of those guys and Nat Cole, they just absorbed the new sounds and went with it. Red Norvo even he liked the modern sounds, so it was kind of a personal thing, and even among the beboppers there were Dizzy and Bird played beautifully together, but Bird never could understand how Dizzy could be a clown while he's still playing this music. Bird wanted to be more considered that the musicians were artists. So,
did you find the new bebop style harder to play as a musician?
Well, some of the tunes were hard, sure, because some of the chord structures were complicated, and that went on right up through Miles Davis. When Coltrane came out with Giant Steps, that was like that strained everybody's ears. We had to slow that tune down in order to understand it. He was able to play it so fast, and there are really big leaps from one chord group to another. That's why it's called Giant Steps.
Mm-hmm. You have, as I mentioned before, a very large discography, both as a sideman and as a leader. You played with Stan Getz, with Jerry Mulligan, with Zoot Sims, with Bob Brookmeyer, Al Kahn, J.J. Johnson, Marion McParland, Benny Goodman, Milt Jackson. I mean, the list just goes on, and it's really impressive. I know this is this could be maybe a hard question, but are there any record dates that you remember with special affection, Bill?
Well, I thought that the Mulligan record called Night Lights was special. That was back to the sextet mode again, and with all people that I love dearly, Jim Hall and Brookmeyer and Art Farmer. It was really, and Jerry wrote some very nice music for it, so I like that one a lot.
And what musicians with whom you've collaborated do you remember with special affection today, all these years later?
Oh, Jimmy Rainey, and I got to play with Al Haig a little bit. He was a strange man, but God, he could play so beautifully. and Duke Jordan also. He would play such gorgeous intros sometimes that you'd hate to come in and spoil it, But, and Carmen Leggio, wonderful tenor player. Freddie Greenwell, wonderful tenor player. And I've got a lot of friends that I'm playing with now that I like a lot. Ryo Sasaki is a good trumpet player. And I've played a couple of gigs with Steve Johns. I think he's a wonderful drummer. But it's just like every job, you look around and enjoy the. Most of the musicians I'm playing with now are a third my age, but wonderful players.
If you had to name on the bass or on other instruments, your, I would say, most influential players, the musicians that have influenced you the most, who would those be? I'm sure there would be a whole slew of them, but who would definitely be there?
Oh, well, I paid the most attention when I was getting started to Oscar Pettiford. He was around, and I got a chance to really soak up what he could do. He was a brilliant player. And Wilbur Ware, and Israel Crosby, and then Red Mitchell. I never tried to play like Red, but I just loved the way he played. He had such an individual. He invented a technique of his own in order to play what he wanted to play. He had just the most interesting imagination. I don't know. There's I hear interesting stuff every time I hear another bass player. I say, "Oh, I gotta steal that."
Are there any other styles of music besides jazz that you have paid attention to over the years?
Well, of course, I've always enjoyed playing with the old guard. Through Marion McPartland, I got to know Jimmy, and Jimmy knew all of those guys, Vic Dickinson and Maury Feld and Dick Hyman, and tremendous a bunch of good players, Yank Lawson. And I always enjoyed playing with those guys.
Well, as we're winding down the conversation, Bill, I have a couple more questions before we finish. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to chat with you and have you share all of these memories from a very long and fruitful recording and professional career in jazz, playing the bass mostly, although not only. And I've always felt, Bill, I don't know how you feel about this, or if you would like to talk about this, but I always feel like the arts, in many ways, go a few steps ahead of society at large. And so, throughout your life, you lived in a United States of America that, in many ways, was very segregated. And yet, however, one thing that is very interesting and has always been interesting to me, and I mention it a lot to my students at the university, is how black and white musicians used to perform together at a time when America was very segregated. What do you remember about that? That's something that has always been interesting to me.
Yeah, well, there was a period there when the younger black musicians were in the vanguard of the peace movement, and they were some of them had the attitude that the white musicians have stolen our music and made all the money, and I think Dizzy Gillespie put it best. He says, "You can't steal a gift. If you can hear it, you can have it." And I thought that was the sweetest, most generous remark that I ever heard. So, but that's true. That racist problem has been hanging over us all of these years, and the musicians figured a way out of it right away. It was just go to the music,
If you think about those early records by the Benny Goodman Quartet, and there were Jewish musicians and black musicians and white musicians playing together, and that was not the way society was back then, but the music did reflect that.
Yeah, it was. That was one thing that Benny was good at. Was he took John Hammond's advice. John had to play some tricks on him sometimes to get him to hear and pay attention to what was going on among the black musicians. When Benny first heard Charlie Christian, because of the way Charlie was dressed, he was a very flamboyant dresser. That he didn't think he was going to be any good. But all it took was a couple of tunes to play with him, and he loved it, you know.
Well, Bill, my final question is, tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, and where, if anywhere, we can hear you play. What projects you've been working on, and what are you doing these days?
Well, during this pandemic, everything got canceled, so I spent most of my time playing at home with my records just to try to keep my hands in shape. And a friend, Nick Schubel, the good drummer, lives down in Rockaway, New Jersey. His daughter is a very good piano player, Leonika, and she's still in college, but she's been studying with some really good people, and she's developed. And I've been playing with her for 2-3 years now, and since I'm in my 90s and Nick is in his 50s and she's in her 20s, we book ourselves as the three generations of jazz. And we've played some concerts and some clubs here and there, you know. And then this trumpet player, Ryo Sasaki, gets a lot of gigs around Soho and Tribeca. He calls me pretty often, and he knows a dozen wonderful guitar players. So it's usually a trio, trumpet, guitar, and bass. And I enjoy that a lot. And once in a while I get a chance to play with Tomoko Ono, a wonderful piano player. I had a steady job over at the Red Hat on the River. It's a restaurant right on the Hudson in Irvington, New York. But they got wiped out twice by hurricanes that raised the level of the river up high enough to wipe out their restaurant twice. So he got to a point where he couldn't afford us, and then the pandemic came, and he was closed for quite a while, and now he's open again, and he's hoping that he'll be able to have music there. That was a nice trio with Hiroshi Yamazaki and Takeshi Ogura, piano and guitar, and me. And so the influence of the Japanese love of jazz has kept me working over here.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because you've been to Japan with your music as well. What is it about jazz that appeals so much to a Japanese ear?
You have to ask a Japanese person. I can't explain it.
But what are the audiences like over there?
Oh, they're very enthusiastic, very courteous, and very kind. The first time I went over was Jerry Mulligan and Brookmeyer and Dave Bailey and me with Jerry. And we played concerts in Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya, Hiroshima, and each place the audiences were just so enthusiastic and so kind. So I hope I get a chance to go over there again sometime.
Well, we hope so, and we're happy to hear that you are staying busy and active, and that is absolutely wonderful. It is very likely that if somebody out there has a Jerry Mulligan record at home, then Bill Crow is playing the bass on it. And looking at a list of Jerry Mulligan or Stan Getz records, there's so many that you've been on, and there's one in particular that I love that has always been one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's the one called Annie Ross Sings a Song with Mulligan. Do you remember anything about those sessions, about playing with Annie? Is there anything that you remember about the singing of Annie Ross, about those sessions from back in 1957 and 58?
Well, I got to be friends with Annie because I was friends with Davy Lambert. And when she turned up, we hit it off really well right away. So I spent a lot of time just hanging out with her. And we would get together and sing. And then they got the Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross idea, and that took off. And then I didn't see her for quite a while, but I was playing a thing with who was I playing with? I can't remember. Anyway, it was one of those clubs down in the 30s, and I looked down in the audience, and there was Annie sitting there, smiling and clapping, and so it was great to see her again. I miss her.
Well, that is definitely a great record, as are many of the others in which you appear both as a sideman and as a leader. And I would like to recommend that everybody out there seeks out the music of jazz bassist Bill Crow. It is really a treat to have had a chance to talk to you, and anyone out there who may wish to know more about Bill Crow, well, there's a website, billcrowbass.com, that I really want to commend you for. It's really nice. It's got a lot of information, a lot of photos that are of interest, and I'll say it again, billcrowbass.com, for anybody out there who may want to learn more about the music of our guest on the Jazz Flashes podcast today, bassist Bill Crow, who joined us from the state of New York on the phone. Bill, it has been an absolute pleasure for me to get a chance to talk to you. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your music. And I just hope that we can stay in touch. I absolutely love your music, and I appreciate your being on the show today.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bill. This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and you can very soon listen to this conversation with bassist Bill Crow, 94 years young, on our show today on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. We recorded this conversation on the phone, direct connection between Jackson, Tennessee and the state of New York. And we did this in January of the year 2022. If you have any comments, leave them under the video. We appreciate your interest. We appreciate your time. Any comments that you might have, we would like to know about them. Thank you so much for listening to the Jazz Flashes podcast. Anton Garcia Fernandez saying goodbye. And remember, we're old. Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn once said, "It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing." Thanks, and see you soon.